Hello, everyone. Um, and oh, Nayan, you're here too. All right, so I am really thrilled for this book chat. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Lemon, and I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at the University of Southern California. And I just want to thank you for joining us today for a conversation about Ketaki Pant's new book, Itinerant Belonging, Intimate Histories of Indian Ocean Capitalism, which was just published by Cambridge University Press in 2025, this year. We do invite everyone who's able to please turn on their camera. It's just a nicer occasion if we can see the faces of colleagues and friends. Thank you so much. It's I know how it is in the Zoom world, but it is just really, really nice if we get a chance to see each other and kind of form a bit of a community, even if it's online. So that way we can see all of us who've come to support Ketaki in her book. So joining us today, we are so happy to have commentators Antoinette Burton, who's a professor of history at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and Sunil Amrith, the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale University and a professor at the Yale School of the Environment. The conversation will be moderated by our colleague, Nayan Shah, who has been he's a professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. And we're hoping that his volume will be here and perfect. And if not, we will brainstorm that. But that won't come up for us for a little bit because the way that the conversation unfolds will be that Ketaki will give us like a 5-minute introduction to the book. We will then have a conversation between herself, Antoinette, and Sunil for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. And at that point, Nayan will open the floor to questions from everyone. And you'll be able to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand, just makes it a little bit easier for him to filter through. I should say that today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Hunnick History Department, the Early Modern Studies Institute, and the Center for Feminist Research. Ketaki, many congratulations again on your wonderful book. Please tell us a little bit about it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca, for that warm introduction and for all your work in the humanities. I especially want to thank Zach for his invaluable work putting this conversation together. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be in conversation with historians I so admire, whose work has made such an impact on my own work. So thank you so much to Antoinette Burton, Sunil Amrith, and Nayan Shah for their engagement with this book. It's also so nice to see so many familiar faces here who I haven't seen in a while, including students and colleagues and mentors. So thank you all for your time and for your engagement. I'll start off by offering some high-level remarks on the book to situate it in place, time, and texture. But I'm very much looking forward to the conversation to dive deeper in. This book, Itinerant Belonging, takes readers to Gujarat's coastline of port cities in Western India that sit at the center of the Indian Ocean world. Specifically, the book takes readers to the doors of old merchant homes or havelis that continue to stand tall in various states of decrepitude and splendor on the ocean's edge. These spaces physically mark long histories of economic circulation and connection across the Indian Ocean in social and intimate terms. The inhabitations of these homes, as the book explores, were major merchants across the region in the 19th and 20th century. They were involved in the British colonial project in Southern and East Africa, in Southern Arabia, and Southeast Asia. They were accountants, bankers, landowners, sugar plantation owners, cotton traders, opium traders, and more, including humble shopkeepers in ports across the ocean from Durban to Rangoon. Despite these businesses and various new frontier economies, these merchants maintained homes in old port cities in Western India to which they perennially returned. Itinerant Belonging asks what happens to our understanding of colonial capitalism across this vast Indian Ocean world when we approach it from the perspective of merchant havelis, or homes, as I said, in old port cities in South Asia. But perhaps equally importantly, the book is also conversely about what happens to our understanding of place and narrative in Gujarat, this region of Western South Asia that has been dominated by nationalist and Hindu nationalist narratives of origins and belonging. When we think about the region through these beguiling old homes and the communities who inhabited them, the major argument of the book is that old homes were part of a vaster set of archival projects in which commercial communities grappled with questions of place and belonging in gendered, racial, and religious terms. Their engagement with oceanic capitalism was not simply an economic one, it was an inhabited one. These inhabitations produced textured, moving, and resonant projects of both belonging and unbelonging, emphasizing certain aspects of community while eschewing others. The book offers a wide-ranging narrative of these homes and projects to track the loss and perseverance, ruin and bloom of itinerant merchant communities as abstracted forms of capital accumulation were offset by tangible projects of social belonging, admittedly with mixed results. In the book, I draw on colonial studies, feminist studies, and history to put pressure on the visual ideologies of the picturesque colonial house within which these old havelis are embedded to track a richer set of relations to past, present, and future as the intergenerational significance of merchant havelis intersected with myriad other temporalities or social experiences of time. The merchant homes in the book then are not alternative archives, right, or repositories for the past historians like me can use as empirical evidence of family narratives. Instead, I consider how they were transformed into archives by mercantile communities, the libraries they created, and the individuals from within them who wrote histories about them. Merchant dwellings, in other words, are a collection of intersecting, overlapping, and contrasting ideas about gender, race, religion, and community that began to take shape in the early 19th century with impacts in the present day, and they reflect what I'm calling itinerant belonging. The chapters of the book use a method of drawing built spaces in the port and my experiences of them into relation with Gujarati, English, Urdu, and other sources from numerous archives, including local libraries across the region and their historiographies on gender and family, colonial bureaucratic records that managed oceanic capitalism, including plantation records, autopsies of workers, reports on domestic life on plantations, and so on, which are histories erased by these old havelis, as well as ongoing inhabitations of residents of these old ports whose lives are marked by 20th century displacements like decolonization. The book centers old merchant homes, but conceptualizes them not as enclosures constrained by their four walls, but instead as sites with conceptual trap doors leading elsewhere, making critical history writing possible. Homes occupy multiple positions in the lives of the commercial communities and histories I track in the book. They are real and imagined, objects of memory and speculation. They are sites of patriarchy and at the same time riposts to colonialism and ethnic nationalism. They are also part, and I'll end my comments here, of a larger history of global capitalism that was architected through collaboration with non-Western communities across the global South. And the book offers us a method for engaging with these vaster archives. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So to that end, let's open it up for Sunil and Antoinette, and then Sunil to ask you some questions.
Great, thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure to read and engage with the research and interpretive frameworks of this book, which help us appreciate such a vibrant array of house and home ecologies. The variety of translocal households that you materialize here, Professor Pant, across so many geographies that are both discrete and interdependent is so impressive. At times, we are left breathless by the scope and scale of itinerant belonging and Indian Ocean World mobilities. And I will just say what a pleasure it is to hear you speak as well. You write so beautifully, and you speak in poetry. That ruin and bloom combination you invoked just now, the conceptual trapdoors, all those are really characteristic of the poesis of your writing. So in some ways, I wish you'd just read from the book, but some other time. Anyway, congratulations, and thanks so much to the Levan Institute for inviting me to be here. My first question is a kind of diagnostic one. Why do you think it's so hard for historians to fully appreciate how and why the household, both as a material site and as an imaginative resource, is about more than simply the domestic? Your work in the book makes the utter embeddedness of house and home in the currents of both port cities and racial capitalism so obvious. But you're mounting a challenge to some very fixed conventions about house and home, even now when there has been so much scholarship on their porous and poetic nature. What are the impediments, methodological, archival, disciplinary, to keeping the entanglements of space and place, what you call the infrastructure of imagination, to the fore when it comes to the household?
Thank you so much, Antoinette, for those incredibly generous and thought-provoking remarks about the book. And really, thank you so much for your engagement with it. And as you know, and as those of you who might have read the book know, the book is really engaged, or takes as its premise and point of departure a number of arguments that Antoinette makes on colonialism, domesticity, the household. So it's a real privilege to be in conversation with you about this, about these questions. Part of me wants to pause and think for half an hour or 10 days about these really incredible questions. But perhaps what I can do is begin to try and answer them as a form of getting into the conversation, though I do think I would have to think about them for longer. Maybe I can start by offering a way into this. Maybe I can start by answering this question by beginning with my own experiences, my first ethnographic encounters with these homes, because I think in a way, the kind of changing way in which I myself have thought about these homes kind of present, a kind of parallel narrative to perhaps, this question of methods, archives, and disciplinary challenges. When I began doing research, and I promise you this is directly related to your question, though I'm starting with the poetic, annoying preamble, which would be cut in edits. When I began research on this book, I was moving through old port city spaces looking for printed records. I was looking for archives in a very narrow sense, based on what I was thinking at the time, more than 2 decades ago, 2 decades ago. And what I found instead were, and I was looking for archives to tell me about a lost past, because this entire world had been destroyed, at least that's what I thought, by a Portuguese armada in the early 16th century. And so I was just looking for sources that would point to this long gone set of communities and histories. And of course, when I did the thing that anthro-historians do, which is go and hang out and walk around, there were these old houses, shimmering, old cities that that were supposed to not be there. And so these houses in that moment, in a historiographical framework, very much presented a kind of alternative source base, right? They appeared to me as archives that I could walk through and tell a different history of this place and kind of rescue it. But as I dug into the research, it was clear to me that these homes themselves were really complex historical objects. They weren't documentary offices. They weren't sites of clear family histories. Instead, they were deeply embedded in these long histories of mercantile and then colonial capitalist connections across the Indian Ocean. And so as I did the book in a way, I think I came into encounter with the methodological, archival, and disciplinary challenges that you describe. And if I was to be very kind of bullet pointed about them, I would say, I mean, despite the 1990s and early 2000s and very strong post-structuralist challenges to a kind of empirical idea of the past, I think that kind of empiricism remains. And I think there is a resistance uh, to historians putting themselves into encounter with spaces like these old homes and these old port cities to not just map and document and master, but instead to ourselves be transformed by these spaces. Because in a way, that's where I started my answer with my arrival in these sports was not, to show authenticity of the I was there, therefore I know variety, but the I was there and I didn't, and if anything, like my skills of disciplinary knowledge were not the skills I needed to understand the places I was encountering. And it was by kind of subjecting myself to, for instance, the poet that stands at the center of the book, this 20th century poet, Asim Randeri, by subjecting myself to his sense of time and chronology and place, that I was able to make sense of this. So in a way, it is a kind of anti-mastery approach, anti-empirical approach that gives us access, I think, to these various temporalities of belonging. I mean, I think I used the material metaphors of ruin and bloom, in part because they kind of give us other shapes of mapping the past. So again, thank you so much for that question. I suspect I'll be thinking about it. It might be the seeds for my next book project, but that's my answer to your question.
Thank you. That was beautiful and brilliant.
Yeah, and let's sort of deepen this conversation further by hearing from Sunil as well.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. It's really been a joy and a privilege to be in conversation with Ketaki for I think almost a decade now. I was just trying to think when we first sort of spoke about this work, I think it was back in 2016 or something like that. And having seen an earlier version of the book and to see what it has become, which is, I think, one of the most important and original interventions in the broad field of Indian Ocean history, British Empire history, in a long time. And I think what it does by putting the household at the center of this vast oceanic space is methodologically innovative, provocative, and I think kind of leads the way and will inspire so much more work. So, I want to start by saying congratulations, Ketaki. And my question goes to where you actually begin the book, which is that at least as I read it and as I understand it also from conversations that we've been in, Ketaki, the very sort of initial impetus for this was actually to think about Gujarat in a different way in light of everything that had happened in Gujarat at the beginning of this millennium, in 2002 in particular. And so one part of this, at least as I understand it, the kind of starting point for this was to try to place Gujarat in these overlapping, intersecting histories, which pushed against the kinds of narratives which had made possible the appalling violence of the early 21st century. And of course, that then, as you've just said so beautifully in answer to Antoinette's question, that might have been what took you there, but you then, opened the trapdoor and a very different set of stories emerged. But you do still begin the book with, Gujarat circa 2000s. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the stakes of that and how by the end of the process of writing the book, after discovering everything that you did, after making the narrative choices that you did, what does it mean to then go back to that question that maybe you started with, which is, where is Gujarat? What does it mean to think about this space differently?
Um, Thank you, Sunil, so much for your comments. I mean, I will get to the question, but it is really a privilege to be in conversation with you. And yes, I didn't realize it is a decade of being in conversation. And I just finished reading your most recent book again. And it's really exciting to think about scholarly temporalities and time as well. So thank you for invoking that. And it's an interesting way for me to orient myself in relation to your question about, where this book began for me, and how, imagining Gujarat otherwise or imagining Gujarat differently, where I am at the end of the process of writing it, because it is very much and I hope I'm understanding your question correctly. And it is very much the case that actually that has been a major, a kind of a changing point of encounter for me with every draft of this book. So I just start in a way at the beginning. I mean, I won't rehearse it in a tedious fashion to the end, but I'll start in the beginning as an orientation point. I began research on this book in 2006, not long after the events that you invoke. And I think appalling violence is it very much captures the shocking and appalling violence, which I say in the book very much gestured to the incredible violence of that accompanied partition, and other violence since, so kind of citations to these forms of cataclysmic violence in South Asia. And so when I arrived to do field work, I mean, those events were still fresh. And very much, it wasn't me going in there because I had read about these events. These events were everywhere. So in a way, there's this moment of violence in the early 16th century with the Portuguese Armada sailing into these ports and burning these port cities to the ground. So especially around there. And then there is also this, many centuries later of a very different kind, but appalling violence that very much marks the landscape. And so I think I was very much impacted by this incredible sense of tension and dissonance between a kind of political and poetic contemporary landscape that was so shaped by erasure and violence, very much anchored in the 21st century and the 20th century. And then these old places that I arrived in that were not marked by these events, but seemed to have rich poetic, political, cultural, social registers of belonging that were very much there, and were very much, were not necessarily related to, or we're not citing the events that seem to preoccupy, our political and scholarly imaginations. So it was this interesting contrast of, these are the minoritized spaces and communities, but they are not their first moment of contact is, or rather their first, not first, but the temporal thresholds of the conversations unfolding in these sports are, Sufi saints from the 1300s and 1857 and reformist movements and, births and deaths and friendship and, a whole set of rich temporalities and moments and narrative experiences and so on that seem unrelated. So I think what was incredible was I think it is impossible to write this book without beginning it with a strong contending with contemporary Gujarat and its politics. Because I think one of the arguments I'm making in the book is, whatever we pick as historians, we're always here in the present moment. And there's a way of accounting for that. It doesn't have to overshadow the book. It doesn't have to take over the categories, but it has to be there. So in an interesting way, at the end, I'll just skip over to the end in order to, and I can come back, where I ended up with was, one of, at least for me, this is a kind of a personal, professional, scholarly answer, is not necessarily a reparative, but maybe an ethical, maybe a respectful, maybe it's a mode of nonviolent engagement. Maybe that's a good way a mode of nonviolent engagement in history with this kind of region is about holding those two things together, which is there is this there are these important political dynamics that can be a point of departure, but ultimately, how do we center other voices, other times, other places? And so one of the things I wanted for the book that I hoped would happen was that it was a book that was rich with other voices and other times that were and were not in engagement with questions of political violence. So I guess it's a preliminary answer to your question, but thank you for that. I will think about that some more.
That was beautiful and inspiring. Thank you.
I just want to say, just as a moderator, that there's a way in which we could say something even more about, before we open things up, about the ending, because the ending invokes the conversation you had with Hannah she's like based in Karachi. She discovers your research in trying to understand a family home that has been abandoned since 47. And you indicate that here we have a situation where there's different kinds of memory that are being produced about this home that you visited and you came to through a whole, sort of rich in-person ethnographic process. I was left with this feeling, however, that of just like the grief that the home is completely abandoned, as opposed to the home the home that's displaced from the Parsi family. I think it's a Parsi family, but it might the Rangoon-based family that also comes back and tells you about this other spectacular home, and you go and see it. And it made me think that there are some strong lines of displacement that are continue to be irreparable, even when you found some interesting moments of trying to think about, say, what's happened to the dining set, what's happened to people's kinship. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more, because it almost felt like the ending was starting you off in a whole new place that you wanted to write another book about, or another novella about, perhaps. And I wanted to hear more about your thinking about where you ended up and what it sort of leads to. What other trapdoors does it lead to?
Thank you so much for that question, Nayan. And also, I should say thank you so much for your engagement with this book throughout, over many years. And it's wonderful to get your reading of the epilogue of the book. And I'm going to have to think about that for day, months, possibly years. But I am really delighted by it, especially because I had a very different reading of the ending. So I would love to chat with you about it and to hear what you think about, my version of what I thought I wrote. So the story that Nayan is mentioning, for those of you who haven't read the book, is the last story in the book, and it's about how a journalist, Hani Yusuf, in Karachi, Pakistan, sends me an email a decade ago after reading something I had written about this family home across the border in Gujarat from where her family is. This was a family who had been based in Rangoon, Burma, Yangon, Myanmar today. And I had written about it as a place of ruin, or a place in ruin, so to speak. There were cobwebs, an old safe. There was a chipped dinner set, and she wrote me this email, and we've had a lovely set of conversations over the last decade about how she recognized this home that she had never seen from conversations her grandparents told her about this home, and that the other half of the chipped dinner set was sitting in front of her in her living room, which was such an astonishing moment. But I begin the book with a kind of ruined history, an argument against ruination, and I end the book with this site, in part because to me it felt like this old house, which I called in my scholarly imagination, Madha Mansion, which was Timla, a completely different place. So I was kind of displacing myself or putting pressure on the limits, of what I can know and tell about these houses. The fact that it was no longer occupied by the family to me didn't feel like the tragedy. If anything, like what I seem to have encountered across the book, with it, these places were like intense sites of erasure and capital accumulation and patriarchy and so on, as much as they were also rich sites of belonging. And so it seemed like there was something more essential about the home that continued to persevere, which was this kind of mark of family and connection, and the ability of accessing a past that isn't materially accessible, but can be accessed through imagination. Uh, I'm so curious to hear if you have a response to this, because your reading of that last scene is so interesting.
Yeah. I'm just reflecting on the fact that I am another generation of Gujarati itinerant belonging and diaspora, and I have, my mother is now in Baroda, in a thriving part of Baroda, but she's also reflecting on all the people in that compound where she lives. They all have these migratory histories, and she's not sure what's going to happen when all of these older women and men pass, about what's going to happen to these homes. And I'm just sort of reflecting, oh, this is a different history, perhaps, but it's also another layered history. And it's also interesting for me to think about places like Randar, and in relationship to the metropolitan New Surat, and how things have changed. So I find that your book is really rich in sort of helping me work through something that is ongoing now for my family and community. And I think that that's true beyond the expanse of the the localities that you have, the places you have looked at. I think there's lots of different opportunities for people. So in that spirit, let's open up the conversation. I'm sure there are many different questions people have here. And there's some wonderful people in the audience I can see. I'm sure they're eager to ask some questions. So we'd love to hear it. Please raise your hand if you can, or it's your chance to ask Ketaki anything.
May I just quickly, while people are waiting, Nayan, just respond to the last thing you said, which was so wonderful. Thank you so much. I will think more about this, especially because Asam Randeri's granddaughter got in touch with me after seeing my dissertation, and we've been in touch for the last 5 or 6 years. And I sent her a copy of the book. And so it'll be very interesting to see what her, to your point about like how our moments of loss and access felt to people who are participants in this history or actually invoke it, or rather actually inhabit it. It'll be very interesting to hear from her about that too. So thank you, and eager to hear questions from the audience. Thank you all for coming.
And I'll also pop in to say that Antoinette and Sunil, you actually didn't get to ask very many questions. So in fact, you may have other questions that you were kind of keen to. So Nayan, Antoinette, and Sunil, this is also a chance for the three of you to continue the conversation that I think you've been having together for a while. So please, we would enjoy we would be the beneficiaries of that if you would like to kind of continue as well. Antoinette, please. I see that you unmuted yourself. So
I'm dying to ask this question. And I swore that I have several other questions to ask, but I wasn't going to leave this room without asking this one. So I'll go ahead. So one of the many things that I really admire about this book is the way it pushes our understanding of the limits and the possibilities of the archives, obviously in new directions. You're invested in critically inhabiting colonial archival records to bring into relation stories segregated across different folders, categories, and locations. Can you tell us, to the extent you're comfortable doing so, something about the challenges of the imaginative, academic, physical labor that was required on your part? Its impact, its wear and tear, on you yourself as the embodied researcher. When you were talking earlier, it really sounded like what was exceptional in terms of how historians typically worked is the way that that embodied experience of going into the Havelis or seeing them from the outside recomposed something in you. There was a kind of recomposition happening, almost an epigenetic way. And I guess I just wondered what it was like, the wear and tear, the ups, the downs, the costs, the affordances on your kind of physical and mental being.
I certainly have varied and myriad responses to this question, but I will say, Antoinette, I mean, I've been in engagement with your arguments about the archive for many years, you know, as a graduate student, as an early scholar, and so on. So I really feel like you created this space for us to really push on the archive in South Asian studies and kind of vernacularize, or I don't even know if that's the right word, but uh, kind of transform that term archive into all of these different figures. And I'm so impacted by so many of our peers in South Asian studies who have done similar types of work. I want to just restate your question in a way just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. I think you were drawing on what I said earlier, and perhaps it's really, I mean, across the book too, about the archive being a place of inhabitation, not only of the people I'm studying, but one of the ways I tried to be accountable as a scholar in this book was to very much be clear that this was my inhabitation as well. Not only in terms of like my gender, ethnicity, caste, and so on, but just my presence there, and therefore suggesting the limits of this history, right? It's limited by my presence. I do think it has become clearer and clearer to me. Kind of, Sunil was asking how my idea of writing about from away from Gujarat has changed over time. I think this is very much the case with the archive, because as I drafted different versions of this project, I mean, the work put enormous strains on me physically, emotionally, mentally, but I think like more so epistemologically and ontologically, in ways that were incredibly, fraying, but also incredibly valuable and transformative. I feel like the amount of pressure exerted on the text by, the challenge of these various archives, the challenges of putting into conversation things not only separated in different archival registers and boxes and categories, but across space, time, world views, ways of inhabitation. Uh, I think helped me. I mean, I don't want to sound grandiose. It sounds a little bit more grandiose than I mean it, but I think helped me to see what a historical practice might look like that isn't about extraction, and might be about uh, a whole variety of other types of things, engagement, encounter, terms that our colleagues use. I think in terms of let me pause. I know that time is at a premium, but I can pause and perhaps I'd be very interested in Sunil, Nayan, others jumping in and drawing me out on this question. But yes.
I just wanted to take it in a slightly different direction, but I think it flows from what you've just said, Ketaki. I think one of the things that you do that's so powerful in this book, in relation to previous work that's been done in the field, is that you connect the old merchant world of the old ports with the brutality of the plantations in a way that I don't think anybody else has done. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that dimension, really, really important dimension of the book. And I say it's linked to what you were saying about your own sort of presence and experience of doing the work, because of course, that is a very moving and very powerful part of the book where you're talking about how these merchant families are themselves then sort of imbricated in the sugar plantations. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how you're doing, how that move within the project came about.
Um, So one of the really interesting things about having the privilege of working on a project over multiple years, having employment that enables one to do that type of work over multiple years, is that in the first draft of the book, it was very much about just trying to make sense of these old houses and these port cities that were there when they were supposed to be silted over and no longer significant. And it was really through, when I looked at the architecture of the homes of these ports, each house in the port signaled, at least in this port run, there signaled a different connection to place. So, this house is locked up and it's the home of where the people in Singapore live, and this house is locked up and it's where people in Malaysia live, and so on. And there were a number that were related to Mauritius. And I initially it was just a map of the Indian Ocean in a way that I could walk across. But then I began to engage with this poet, Asim Randeri, who had himself written about his own city, and that was important to me. And he spoke about one of his father's very close friends, Alam Khan, Rahmat Khan, in this book, who had been the owner of a sugar plantation. And it was kind of a very brief remark that seemed to not warrant any more information. Like the narrative of this merchant in Asim's book was kind of hagiographic. These were the great deeds. This was the philanthropic investment in the port, and so on. So in the next round of doing the project after I had my PhD, I actually just followed that brief footnote to Mauritius to see what I could find of this merchant. And in the book, it said that this person owned a plantation called Belem Estate. And so I was like wandering around Port Louis asking for Belem, like, what is this Belem Estate? It turned out it was Belombre, which is, French transliterated into Gujarati as Belem. And so I arrived in the archive, not with the sense of, let me see what the archives will share in an organic way, but it was very much to see, like, is this colonial archive going to help me find information about this merchant who is going to be cataloged and archived in a completely different way through these records. And it was very interesting moving from this kind of ethnographic, cultural engagement in Randare across the Indian Ocean to Port Louis to see a completely different archive. And as I write in the book, I initially just looked up in the notarial files what I could find on Alam Khan, and I found a marriage contract to a Creole, a French Mauritian person, and there was a very kind of orderly, organized set of property relations and marriage relations. But it was impossible to not then encounter the morass of the indentured files. And so it was this kind of encounter with place, right? So seeing the archive not as a repository of this merchant, but seeing it as a place just like the Haveli, right, with rooms and trapdoors and forms of engagement that led me to this dense set of relations that the merchants of Randare were part of. I think a different way to answer your question, Sunil, is that the poet Asim Randeri also showed me that part of this understanding of place was kind of traveling in a poetic way across the Indian Ocean. And so in a way, I was bringing his poetic sensibility to these brutal archives and drawing this story together. I'll say one final thing, which is putting pressure on the visuality of these old homes as, sites of family enabled me to write other familial relations beyond the patriarchal family, right? To see the plantation as giving us a set of brutal but conceptual tools to understand the old merchant world, as you put it, and to track these connections. I wonder if I addressed your question or if there was a follow-up. Or if you had any thoughts.
Absolutely. I think that pathway, I think, really speaks to what is so generative in your approach in the book that, in a sense, it's from Asim Randery's poetry that you find yourself suddenly in sort of in the midst of the indenture files. And I think that, you know, there's a creativity there. There's a sort of a set of imaginative leaps that you're able to make, which shows how imbricated all of these worlds ended up being in the 19th century. And I think that's what's so really powerful in the work.
And that chapter 2 is such a strong, interesting chapter because you open with the song of a indentured woman from prison, and it's not where we expect to be. We don't expect you don't start the chapter off with like, oh, let me tell you about this poet and what he did and this chronicle and this family, and you don't start with Khan. You start with and you end and start with the song that's heard of the suicide and of the woman who commits suicide, in distress. And I just wondered, like, how did you come to that? Like, how did you creatively move there in a way that felt like it was clearly what you committed to in that chapter? And I find it a astonishing chapter to read.
Thank you for that question. It really helps me to also address and credit the incredible set of, historiographical engagements and encounters that really shaped the book. Because as much as this was a book about, engaging with and being transformed by archives, it really was a deep engagement across multiple fields. And one of the things that has been so valuable is reading all the incredible scholarship that has come out of feminist studies of indenture, from Gayatri Bahadur to Arunima Datta to numerous scholars of the Indo-Caribbean. And to really kind of take lessons from feminist historians about what it means to engage with the colonial archive. And so if one of the things that one of the things I was arguing was, or rather one of the things I was trying to tread delicately on was this the incredible social and political projects of old Muslim spaces in Gujarat, right? That these homes are not just sites, for me to put pressure on and transform into this and that narrative, but are sites that are, looking back on 500, 1,000 years, even if from the 19th and 20th centuries, and trying to make arguments about place, belonging, and so on. But I was trying to, I was trying to manage that set of commitments with the very real patriarchies and dispossessions that get architected through these spaces at this time as well. And so in reading this feminist scholarship, it did seem like who we place at the center of our narratives really mattered at some basic level. And so creatively and intellectually, it really seemed to me a question, right? Like, what would basmati, this indenture, this incredibly this incredibly striking indentured woman who I only got a fragment of in the archive, what would she have said to Asim Randery, or what would she have made of this world? And while I couldn't ask her, I didn't have enough information, it felt a way to stage that through creating these, conceptual moves that underlined her presence. And I think coming back to Sunil's point about drawing mercantile or these like old merchant worlds of the Indian Ocean together with the brutality of the plantation, it seemed like the way to do that was through an archival practice, a storytelling practice that brought these worlds together in the subjunctive, right? So I didn't know, I didn't have answers to the questions, but it seemed important historiographical and narrative ground to cover, I suppose, would be a way to, yeah.
Thank you. Are there questions that have been stimulated by our discussion here that people want to ask and raise?
I'm really tempted to call on Himani as my former student, as though we're in a class, but that's not the case. So Himani, you're safe.
Lindsay has a question. And Himani, you will have one soon, right?
Yeah, Hamani, think of a question. It's good to see you. And Jasmine, I saw earlier. I don't know if she's still here, but there you are, Jasmine. Ketaki, thank you. It's been fun to hear more about your book. And the thing that we've been talking a lot about these kind of connections between kind of present and past. And I was wondering if people kind of have contacted you before, like when they saw your dissertation or other things you wrote. Have people contacted you since the book came out? Have you gotten has this like struck other people and kind of expanded that reach? Or like how did that woman who you gave the book to, who's been on this journey with you, what was her reaction? So I'm just curious if this journey has kind of continued for you as well.
Um, Thank you, Lindsay. That's such a wonderful question, and thanks for being here and for being in engagement with the book for so long as well. Um, Given the price in hardcover, I don't know who is contacting me about the book, even from a scholarly perspective. But in all seriousness, so it was a really incredible moment during the pandemic when Asim Randeri's granddaughter sent me an email saying that her and her father had found the dissertation version of this on the internet, and that they were really moved and surprised to see, their grandfather and father featured in this central way, because they just remembered him as, a person kind of obsessed
Yeah.
with writing and like running around the port and doing all of. So I think it was this moment of recognition. And then it turned out that she lives in California. So there are these interesting transnational histories and roots, that these poetic moments take. I have recently sent her the book, and she's reading it right now. So
Yeah.
I haven't gotten a response from her. But I wanted to draw out another aspect of your question and maybe frame it more broadly, which is one of the things I tried to do in the book too, was to really be clear about how my work doesn't really speak for the communities and their poetic projects, and that actually there are real limits to academic genres of writing, and what we are able to reach for, what is within our purview. And so at various moments in the book, I point to and cite kind of archival projects, scholarly projects, poetic projects from within these communities that, that are writing histories and, and getting at things that I could never reach for, and that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to reach for. So that felt really important. And maybe this also connects back to questions that Antoinette and Nayan have asked earlier, about the poetics of this book or the historiography of this book or the archival orientation of this book, which is that I think in part, and maybe this is a different way of answering your question about like why start here, or what shapes those choices, is a kind of writerly sense of the limits of certain linear forms of history, that what seemed most essential about what I had found or what I wanted to engage with during research couldn't really be laid out chronologically, or couldn't really be laid out causally, or couldn't be laid out in that way, but that it could really teach us something, poetically or narratively. Yeah, so that would be another answer. Thank you, Lindsay, for that question.
Indeed. Other questions people have? Yes, Jake.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Ketaki. So if you'd be so kind as to let me just kind of read off my question, because I had to kind of like consolidate it into like typing out first. Um, so first of all, I love the book. Um, Second, I guess, and this just kind of builds off of what you just remarked upon. One way that I understand your book is sort of as an intimate, non-teleological history of racial capitalism in the Indian Ocean. Um, and I see that in two ways. So first, you follow multiple forms of differentially coerced mobilities across space and time through a kind of what I would call critical or counter-archival methodology. And then second, your narrative does not follow a kind of rigid structuralist accounts of dependency or peripheralization of sort of like the Indian nation state or Pakistani nation state within the sort of like post-colonial world. And instead, you sort of focus on layered forms of extraction down to the archive that are often sort of, in some of the words that you've used before, are papered over. Um, so those are the kind of the premises of how I understand your work. And here's the kind of much bigger question or set of questions. Based on that kind of framing, I guess the question is, how do you understand your work and like the specificity of the subjects that you're engaging with, helping us redirect our understandings of these kind of broader concepts like racial capitalism, capitalism, the Indian Ocean, so on and so forth. So what does the kind of the specificity of these kind of non-linear histories that you're engaging with help us understand the kind of wider frameworks that we conventionally use to frame these histories?
Hi, Jake.
Hello.
Terrific question. It's so great to see you. Congratulations on some recent good things that have happened to you that I heard about. And thank you for that really wonderful and rich reading of my work. I took some notes. It's always great to hear, what one's book is about, because I will say when all said and done, it's bigger, or it's sort of more elusive than it immediately seems. In terms of your question, there are many ways to answer this question, and I suspect, over coffee might be a longer conversation. But very quickly, since I know we're running out of time, I would say one of the things that I hope that I wanted the book to do, I mean, the verdict is in whoever reads it, in terms of these larger questions, like you're saying, right? Like, how does this particular practice, if I understand you correctly, this particular archival practice, argumentative narrative practice, and the specific worlds I look at, like, how does that shape, or what does that propose as a method for the Indian Ocean, racial capitalism, and so on? I think the book is an argument for place and texture and specificity. I think non-teleological, non-linear. It's not a research methodology that I'm like pushing as the way to do something, but it was more a research method that could be used if one's questions are how can we be historians? Of smaller things when we are studying larger things. I guess that seems really simplistic, but I think there is a tendency when we're looking at, not a tendency actually. I mean, there are many books that don't do this at all, but there could be a tendency that when we're looking at vast expanses, the Indian Ocean, racial capitalism, and so on, that really bring vast geographies together, to then fall back into older forms of argumentation that behold us to linear forms of history or making more teleological claims and so on, just in order to bring these different large worlds, large scale forms of arguments together. But I think this method is to say you can do big histories in small ways, I suppose. I suppose that would be my answer to your question at 1:01 p.m. But again, thank you, Jake. That was wonderful.
Yeah, that was really wonderful and great way of ending this conversation. Sort of the world of small things and imaginations that sort of refract out into different ways of thinking, as you said, cohabitational belonging, which I think is a really interesting set of concepts. And there's so many of them in this book, which is available through many different means. So please get yourself a copy of the book or access or pillage one from the library or whoever else you need to. And thank you so much for this conversation. It's been so generative and so wonderful to see so many of you and to be engaged conversation with Antoinette and Sunil. Ketaki, obviously, we are so indebted to you for making all this possible.
And I just want to quickly say, Rebecca, thank you so much, Antoinette, Sunil, and Nayan, for your incredible conversation today, and to everybody else.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon. You've given us so much to think about.
Thank you.